This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. A leading economist says the Dodd-Frank bill is not enough reform, and the first order of business is to resist the forces trying to weaken regulation of Wall Street. A labor leader says the 2014 midterms are going to be just as important to Democrats as the 2012 presidential election was. And Bill Press speaks with Dick Durbin, the assistant majority leader of the Senate. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Dr. Alan Blinder is a former vice chairman of the Fed. He's warning that Wall Street reforms under the Dodd-Frank bill are not enough and that Democrats need to resist continuing attempts to let the big banks run wild again. Joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Alan Blinder is the Gordon S. Rentschler Memorial Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at the Princeton Department of Economics and served both on President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors and as vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. He is the author of a new book, After the Music Stopped, about the financial crisis of 2008 and beyond. Dr. Blinder, you are one of this nation's leading economic lights. Thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Now, you've just written this book about the near collapse of the banking system only 5 years ago. Who was really responsible for that?
Well, a full answer would take more time than you've got on this show. Let me give you a very brief answer. It was a lot of people. It was the financial industry, not just the banks narrowly construed, but the industry as a whole. It was the regulators who were too often looking the other way or even doing the wrong thing. And frankly, part of it was us, we Americans who fomented, I won't say single-handedly, but we were the main protagonists in fomenting the housing bubble that burst so loudly.
Now, the Bush and Obama administration's response, which most people call a bailout of the banks, worked. Did it or did it not? And if so, how well did it work?
I think it definitely worked. I don't think there should be any doubt about that. If you remember its purpose, the purpose was to save the financial system from going down the drain. And I think it worked. Could it have been better? Yes, I think so. And I've been critical, including critical in this book that you mentioned, of a number of features of the bailout as it was actually promulgated by the Bush administration. Remember, the bank bailout came in October 2008. I was critical of not forcing any public purposes on the banks, such as lending or even maintaining lending, never mind lending more. I was critical about allowing banks still to pay dividends while they were receiving taxpayer support, not to mention too generous executive pay, which Tim Geithner made a bit tougher when he became secretary, and critical about not buying troubled assets. If you recall, the name of the program, TARP, stood for Troubled Asset Relief Program. Congress was sold the notion reluctantly that the Treasury had to buy up some of these toxic assets that were killing the markets in general and the banks in particular, but it never did that. It actually put capital into banks. That may or may not have been a good idea, but it gave the whole program an ugly bait-and-switch appearance.
We're speaking with Dr. Alan Blinder, Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at the Princeton Department of Economics. A lot of people were critical of the Obama stimulus program enacted right after he took office. How do you assess the Recovery Act? Did that work?
There was criticism on both sides. From the left, criticism that it was too small, and from the right, criticism that it was misguided, didn't work, made big government, etc. I'm much more sympathetic to the stimulus. I think it had about the effects you'd expect, which are sizable but not gigantic, in particular not enough to stop the recession. But we knew that at the time. I don't believe the president could have gotten a very much bigger stimulus through the Congress, even if he tried. You remember he barely got through the one that he managed. And I'm totally unsympathetic to the notion that you really do hear. I find it unbelievable that the stimulus somehow didn't create any jobs. I mean, just think of assigning to the Treasury and the OMB the task of spending over $800 billion without creating any jobs. They would have no idea how to do it. It's impossible, basically.
Was the stimulus enough? I know that there were folks out there that were saying, "Hey, 1.8 trillion, 1.2 trillion," and the word was that you know what? We don't want to mention the T word. That's not going to sell. Should that have actually happened in hindsight?
I think it was impossible in hindsight. A number of people living comfortably in the ivory tower suggested, and some in the administration, by the way, also suggested topping the $1 trillion level. I believe that would have been impossible and maybe created the danger that the whole stimulus would just topple and not be enacted in the first place. So it looks to me, given how little, if you'll recall, Republican support the stimulus garnered, negligible Republican support, and barely squeaked through the Congress, that they pretty much pushed the political limits. But on pure economics, if there was no politics involved, yes, I think it probably should have been bigger.
Now, going back a few years, was it the Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 that laid the groundwork for the housing bubble and irresponsible banking practices, or does that stem from somewhere else?
I think it mostly stems from somewhere else. I think the Bush tax cuts were a mistake for other reasons. For example, ruining the long-run budget picture, making tax cuts we couldn't really afford in the long run. But I wouldn't blame them for the housing bubble. That was just starting in the early Bush administration and really gathered tremendous steam during the administration. But I don't think the Bush people were actually pumping up the bubble. That was us, as I said before. That was we Americans getting a little bit crazy about housing, with the belief that you can never lose money on housing, you could only win, and so on. What I do blame the Bush administration for, and others, is the lax regulation that I alluded to earlier. We could have, I don't want to say stopped this bubble, but we could have had a much smaller bubble with much less deleterious effects when it burst if we had been more on guard in the regulatory realm.
There were certainly those that and they said this about the stock market too in the mid to late 90s before that burst as well, but there were plenty of people on the sidelines that were saying, better be careful here, what goes up must come down, and it seems that nobody wanted to listen. Everyone was enjoying the profits and the newfound wealth.
I think that's exactly right, and sad to say, even many of the regulators got caught up in the euphoria of the day, thinking that the world was a lot safer than it actually was.
So let me ask you this. I mean, with this financial wreckage, could some of this be laid at the feet of Alan Greenspan, who was then Fed chairman, and also Glass-Steagall, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which allowed commercial banks to sell securities? I mean, is it a combination of all these things? Can you put more weight on one than the other?
You can put more weight on one than the other, and let me start at the second part. I put essentially no weight on the repeal of Glass-Steagall. A lot of people have blamed that. That happened in 1999, and a lot of people have blamed it for some of the bad things that happened after. But if you actually examine the details, and you don't have to go way, way deep, just at the sort of course level, the details, what you find is a lot of investment banks that weren't at all in the banking business, the commercial banking business, deposit taking and lending. A lot of those investment banks did awfully stupid things. Also, a lot of banks that were not involved in investment banking in any way or any significant way did a lot of dumb things, like making some of these crazy mortgages that never should have been made. It is very hard, and I would argue impossible, to find anything very substantive that was done only because the barriers between investment banking and commercial banking had been torn down. There's basically nothing. To the first part of your question, I think the regulators in general, and you named Alan Greenspan in particular, do shoulder part of the blame for the reasons I alluded to before. They were caught up in the euphoria of the market. They were excessively invested in a laissez-faire approach to the markets, a belief that what the markets did was right just because they did it. And they were looking the other way when they could have been cracking down on these practices, especially the horrible banking practices that I just mentioned.
Is the Dodd-Frank Act enough to stop this kind of disaster from happening again? And if not, what should Congress or the President do next?
I think it is definitely not enough in the sense that will Dodd-Frank stop financial bubbles? Never mind housing, could be stocks the next time, who knows what it is. Will Dodd-Frank stop financial bubbles in the future? No. Nothing has ever been able to stop financial bubbles ever since there's been finance. So I don't believe Dodd-Frank will do that, and financial bubbles are potentially troublesome when they burst. But I think there's a lot in Dodd-Frank, if we promulgate it, that will make the system safer so that when the bubble bursts, whatever the next bubble is, it doesn't threaten to bring down the entire financial system, which is what happened this time around. And so my main answer to the last part of your question is we actually have to promulgate Dodd-Frank. People often forget that. Both Dodd and Frank are gone as champions in the Congress. There are many people in the Congress, generally on the right rather than on the left, that want to repeal Dodd-Frank or want to chip away at it or want to undermine it by not giving enough resources to regulators or want to amend it in a variety of ways to make it softer. I think the first order of business is resisting those forces. Okay.
Alan Blinder is the Gordon S. Rentschler Memorial Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at the Princeton Department of Economics. Of course, served as Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Author of a new book, After the Music Stopped, about the financial crisis of 2008 and beyond. Dr. Blinder, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Well, thank you.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Paul Booth has spent his life as a labor organizer and political strategist. He's warning progressives that the 2014 congressional elections are just as important as the 2012 presidential election. That's coming up in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Big doings in Big D. The George W. Bush Presidential Library, Museum, and Institute has opened with elaborate fanfare. And what a piece of work it is. A $250 million, 226,000 square foot edifice on 15 acres. Never has something so large been built to contain something so small, namely the thoughts and record of achievements by this two-term president. His brick and limestone structure is certainly imposing, but once inside, you quickly see that it's a $250 million can of whitewash. Of course, all ex-presidents want libraries that show their good side, and Bush himself was organizer-in-chief of this monumental altar to himself. What's most striking is not what's in it, but what's not. For example, where's that Mission Accomplished banner that he used as a political prop in May 2003 when he strutted out so fatuously on the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, wearing a flight suit to pretend like he had won the Iraq War? And how about a video loop of him finally showing up in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, cluelessly praising his infamously incompetent emergency management honcho with the now notorious shout-out, "Heck of a job, Brownie!" Also, while there are 35 featured videos, a replica of W's Oval Office, narrated presentations by top Bush officials, and even statues of the family dogs, where's Cheney? Shouldn't there be an animated exhibit of the Vice in his dark chamber, scheming to shred our Constitution and set up an imperial presidency? Another essential element of Georgia's tenure that goes unportrayed here would be called the dead garden of compassionate conservatism. This is Jim Hightower saying, why spend $250 million when they could have said it all with a $25 a gallon can of whitewash?
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. In the continuing battle for human rights, the focus has shifted from the federal courts to state legislatures. And that is not necessarily a bad thing, says labor leader Paul Booth. And joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Paul Booth is executive assistant to the president of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Workers, formerly organizing director of the union. He's played a key role in many important labor initiatives, including forging labor unity in response to the attacks on worker rights after the 2010 election. Paul Booth, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Well, thank you for having me.
You've spent your entire career in the labor movement. How do you account for the dramatic decline in union members in America, now down to under 12% of the workforce? I mean, how must you feel?
Well, let's get the history right. The decline of the union fraction of the American workforce is a trend that has been underway for better than 50 years. Headlines that we get every year when the numbers come out that show that our fraction has stayed the same or fallen again are nothing new. American labor movement peaked during the Second World War and the years immediately thereafter for 2 reasons, one of which has never changed, and that is that organizing together for a voice at work is the only and best way for workers of every kind and any kind to equalize the odds between their employers on what the deal is going to be for how much they get paid and what kind of conditions under which they work and what kind of opportunities they can create for their families. That has never changed. What has changed is the underlying legal framework. In 1947, after the 1946 election, which, like the 2010 election, was a big victory for Republicans, the next thing that happened was the enactment of the Taft-Hartley Act, the amendment to the National Labor Law. And that Taft-Hartley Act gave employers the legal that they have used to a great advantage to block workers and intimidate workers from exercising what should be a true freedom to choose to unionize. And so you look at those charts and you see that going back to the early 50s, after the Taft-Hartley Act took effect, this decline has been consistent with slight gradations during that whole history, and it's because the labor law that had been enacted under FDR in 1935 got changed in a fundamental way. So that's the history. The labor movement has had peaks and valleys in terms of the energy with which we tried to find new ways of organizing and giving workers a chance to get a voice at work. And almost all of that success has come outside of the jurisdiction of the Taft-Hartley Act. Farm workers who organized in the 60s did it outside the jurisdiction of the Taft-Hartley Act. Public employees who organized in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s and still are organizing also had to do it in outside that framework. Home care workers and child care workers, unions since the turn of the millennium, over 1 million of them also invented new ways of getting their rights. And so what we have is an out-of-date labor law covering diminishing proportion of the workforce, the part of the employment, part of American employment where there's a conventional relationship between a private employer and employees. Doesn't cover people who are individual contractors. It doesn't cover people who work for intermediary kind of organizations who may work for Walmart, but they're not paid by Walmart. They're paid by some shell company that's been set up to be the employer of record. Doesn't work for any of those kinds of occupations and groups, but it worked for those who find a way to make it work for themselves. Nothing is as good an equalizer in the employment relationship than as compared to trade unionism. Nothing is as effective an anti-poverty strategy as unionism. So as long as the need is there, there will be people finding a way to forge a path to uniting together, forming unions, and getting a voice at work.
Okay. Now, Republican governors and state legislatures, though, seem to have public employee unions as their main targets. So what are the bright spots for the movement? I mean, it's certainly you've covered some of that there, but how do you deflect that kind of target that the Republicans seem to have put on the backs of unions?
Well, I don't think they put it on their backs. I think they put it right smack in our fronts.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I drew the analogy between the 1946 Republican sweep and the 2010 one because they are very similar in a crucial respect, which is that the incoming politicians who, with their newly created power, decided to prioritize anti-union change. And it's a contrast to the electoral success they had after 1994. Now, the Gingrich election in 94, Republicans came to power, but they didn't go after the unions then. They went after Medicare, Medicaid, and the social safety net. That was the priority that to choose then. This time, they said, well, we'll get around to the social safety net first. Let's see if we can cripple a successful portion of the American labor movement, the public employee portion, the teachers, the sanitation workers, the librarians, the police and fire who provide public safety. So that was high on their agenda, and we've been in pitched battle to defend our rights in any number of states since the 2010 election. We've taken some real hits. We've taken a beating in Michigan. We've taken a beating in Wisconsin. But I want your listeners to know that isn't the whole story of the last 2.5 years. With a great deal of courage, workers have pulled together in other states, in Ohio, for example, and repealed the anti-labor law that was passed there. By vote of the citizens of Ohio. 62% of the voters in Ohio in November 2011 repealed the anti-union law that had been enacted by the state legislature there. In New Hampshire, they tried to pass right to work, and we stopped them. We stopped them. We stopped anti-union laws by going to court in a number of states. In Arizona, just the other day, the federal court struck down the Governor Brewer's anti-union law as unconstitutional. This is a battle that we're waging every day in the trenches, and the trenches are located in the 50 state capitals of America. I was struck by something that the chief executive officer of the NAACP said yesterday at a rally in Memphis, Tennessee. He said that the biggest battles for human rights in America that took place in the 20th century were decided in the federal courts. And he said the biggest battles that are taking place for rights in the 21st century are being decided in the 50 state legislatures of America. We need to turn our attention to those 50 locations because of the huge consequences, not just for union rights, but for reproductive rights for women, for civil liberties, for health care. It's the state legislatures that are deciding how and whether we really get full universal health care in America. After Congress enacted the law and Obama signed it, it's still up to the state legislatures. That's where public education is being battled out. So it's in Tallahassee and Jefferson City and Juneau and St. Paul and Boston and Annapolis. Those are the places that deserve our steady attention. And when we have the elections in 2014, I would say to you, those are as important as the election we just had in 2012 for worker rights and for a whole series of.
We're speaking with Paul Booth, Executive Assistant to the President of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Workers. So, Paul, before we let you go, with all the and you just mentioned 2014, we've got all these Democratic old-timers who have announced their retirement, Tom Harkin, Carl Levin, Jay Rockefeller. Is the Senate a lost cause in 2014?
No more than it was a lost cause in 2012 and 2010. In both of those cycles, the Republicans had every expectation of taking back the majority, and they came up short. How did they manage to do that? Well, partly they shot themselves in the foot. They had battles over who they were going to nominate, and they severely wounded their own nominees in the primaries. Tommy Thompson should be the senator from Wisconsin today, but he went through a terrible primary, and in the course of that primary, he got up and said the most incredibly stupid things in order to try to win that primary. He said that he'd be the best qualified person to kill Medicare and Medicaid. Well, that didn't sit well with the voters in the general election. So that's part of the reason they didn't make it, and they're about to go ahead and have those intramural wars for nominees for 2014 as well. They're going to nominate Steve King in Iowa to run for the Tom Harkin seat. That man gives Michelle Bachmann a run for her money as the most reactionary member and bigoted member of the U.S. House of Representatives. I don't think he can win an election in Iowa. So that's one thing. But the other thing is we focused our efforts. We're never going to outspend the Republicans, but we did spend every dime we could raise. And we on our side, we have to continue the habit of in this era of Citizens United, we've got to shell out. We've got to raise money and to be competitive, and we need to compete. And we need to have the army that mobilized to elect Barack Obama last year needs to get back on the streets, and in these states we need to have the same kind of voter contact and ground operation that served us well. I think there's a formula to winning. I think we can put forward candidates who are more attractive to the voters than the ones the Republicans are going to nominate, and they'll take that same kind of combination of good luck and good hard work to bring us through, and I think we can get there.
Very good. Paul Booth, Executive Assistant to the President of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Workers, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Paul, as always, thank you so much for your time today. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you very much.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect Stand Up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Dick Durbin, the Assistant Majority Leader of the Senate.
Hey, there's good news for all Americans out of the Senate yesterday. Any money you make up to $250,000, you're going to get a tax cut on that news if it could get through the Republicans in the House of Representatives. One of the leaders of the Senate who engineered that tax cut through the Senate yesterday joins us now. He is a man, one of the first members of Congress I met when I came to Washington some 16 years ago. Welcomed me to Washington. He's been a good friend ever since. Now, Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois. Hey, Senator, good morning.
Hey, Bill. Good talking to you.
All right. We haven't seen each other for a while, but it's good to hear your voice and have you on the program. So tell us about this tax cut. This was very unusual yesterday to get this vote, and to some Republicans even to go along with it, right?
Well, McConnell's back was against the wall. You see, we had engineered a procedural vote on a tax cut for people making up to $250,000, and his members were going to face a vote. They only could vote no because it's a president's plan. They don't vote for anything the president supports, and they would be voting against a tax cut. So they came in and said, well, here's the deal. We want to offer our deal, which is tax cuts for everybody, including the wealthiest. And Harry Reid did a masterful job over the course of a week and said, fine, we'll give you a vote on yours, you give us a vote on ours, but one condition. It's a majority vote, the traditional vote in the Senate, not a 60-vote margin. Well, they were back to the wall, and they had to take it. The vote took place yesterday. The Republican plan of tax breaks all the way to the heavens for the wealthy as well went down. I think the vote was 45 to 54. Then came the Democratic plan, President Obama plan, which would give tax cuts to every middle-income and working family, in fact, to everybody, up to $250,000 of income, and it passes, 51-48. So it was an indication to me of the sentiment within the Democratic Party, strong sentiment behind the president and behind reasonable tax cuts. Bill, the good news is, for those of us who are rooting for this, is now the ball is clearly in John Boehner's court. He can decide right now whether or not working families, middle-income families, are going to get a tax increase or a tax break at the end of the year.
It really does. It really does put it in that ball is squarely right in John Boehner's court, right, and the House Republicans, and they're going to have to either vote for it or face the voters in November and explain why not.
And the Senate Republicans, if they're any indication, will tell us what's going to happen. The Senate Republicans, not a single one of them, after their proposal for tax cuts for everybody up to the highest income levels, failed. Not a single Republican would then vote for a tax cut for middle-income families. So their position is, if you can't give a tax break to the wealthiest people in America, then we're not going to allow tax breaks for anybody. As Harry Reid said, one of the great moments on the floor, he said, now he knew Grover Norquist was up there a few weeks ago because he was afraid that his Republican acolytes were getting shaky, and they all stood in line and politely renewed their vows to Grover Norquist that they'd never vote for a tax cut unless the wealthy also received it. So that's what happened yesterday. I'm afraid that's what's going to happen in the House.
Senator, doesn't it also show how much could be accomplished in the Senate if you just had a majority vote on every issue?
Amen.
Right?
We have, amen. Bill, you talked about meeting me when you first came to Washington, and I will tell you that at that point in time, a 60-vote requirement in the Senate was as rare as could be, and now it is the routine. And it means that we just lurch from one Republican filibuster to the next, and it has really made the Senate a feckless institution. You know, we do rise above that once in a while when it comes to transportation bill and the farm bill and such, but now we have just spent 2 or 3 wasted weeks here because of Republican filibusters. And for a lot of us who didn't run for office for a pension but wanted to get something done in this country, it's a frustration.
Senator, let me ask you this about items on the agenda for the rest of the year. President Obama, speaking to the Urban League yesterday, did say it's time for some conversation, even time for some action on some reasonable gun control. Is there any chance that something as basic as renewing the ban on assault weapons, which even President George W. Bush supported, could be voted on and get through the Senate this year?
I support the assault weapons ban. I'm a co-sponsor of the bill that would limit the sale of these high-capacity magazine clips. And I also think that we should be careful when it comes to selling guns, not to sell them to people with either a terrorist, criminal background, or mental instability. I support all that. What are the chances of the even the consideration, let alone passage of those measures this year? Zero.
Zero to be even debated?
Perhaps a debate, perhaps a vote. But not even close to passage.
Is the NRA that powerful, Senator?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I guess.
And there are members of both political parties. The last time we had a test vote on an NRA-related issue goes back to Senator Ensign, who's resigned from the Senate from Nevada. But he offered something relative to the District of Columbia, which I thought was just irresponsible. It would have allowed virtually anyone to own a gun in the nation's capital without even a background check, without even establishing the fact that they could see or that they had any capacity to handle a firearm. And it passed overwhelmingly. Every single Republican vote and a majority of the Democratic senators voting for it as well.
Senator Dick Durbin joining us by phone. He is, of course, the Assistant Senate Majority Leader at durbin.senate.gov. Related to the tax cut, Senator, I want to go back now to the financial side, and that is there's a lot of fear now about, oh, my God, we put this sequestration there in the debt ceiling agreement. Republicans insisted on it, right, and as a hammer, and now we're stuck with it. Is there any chance that sequestration could be undone before the end of the year?
I hope it isn't, and I'll tell you why. We've got to face the music here. And many, in fact, virtually all of the Republican senators coming to the floor to criticize sequestration voted for it. They voted for the Budget Control Act, which said if the Super Committee can't cut $1.2 trillion out of the deficit over the next 10 years, we're going to go into automatic spending cuts. And they voted for it. It is a bitter pill. It's tough medicine. There is no other way, Bill, to force both sides to the table and to force, in this circumstance, Republicans to finally turn their back on their pledge to Grover Norquist and remember the oath they took under our Constitution to really serve this nation. That is the only way to bring them to the table. I hope we never reach sequestration, but I'm not going to take it away, because without it, we're just not going to deal with the deficit in a responsible way.
It's sort of you made your bed, you've got to lie in it now, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I will tell you, on these defense cuts, first, I want the strongest military in the world. I don't want America coming in second in any war. When my nephew went to Afghanistan 2 years ago, I wanted to make sure he had everything he needed to come home safely, and thank God he did. That's where we start. But when it comes to the Pentagon, let's be honest for a moment. We have thrown away and wasted more money in the Pentagon in the name of national security than we ever should have. We can save money there without compromising our national security.
And how about this? There's not too much talk, Senator. Final question. I know you've got a busy day. I'll let you go. But what is the impact of this sequestration on the other side, on the domestic side? We don't talk much about that, but that would also be.
That's a good point, and I'm glad you raised it, because Danny Inouye, the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, reminded us that over the last 11 years since we last balanced the budget, that account, the non-defense discretionary spending account, has gone up zero in terms of constant dollars, 0%. Defense spending, incidentally, has gone up 73% since we last balanced the budget. So when we talk about an even cut on both sides, let me tell you, the money we plowed into the Pentagon for Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of it wasted on contractors. We can't even find accountability on them. That sort of thing is where we ought to go to cut unnecessary spending in the Pentagon. Instead of cutting help for students to go for college education, National Institutes of Health research. These are things we don't want to cut.
Well, Senator, again, good work yesterday. Congratulations on that.
Thanks,
we'll
Bill.
See what the House does. And thanks so much for your time this morning, Senator. Good to talk to you again.
Good talking to you too, Bill. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks. Dick Durbin, Senator from Illinois, senior senator from Illinois. Remember, he's we talked about this back at the time. He was the first one to go to the junior senator from Illinois and say, you know what, Barack? You got to think about running for president. And what do you know? Here we are.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Alan Blinder, Paul Booth, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org